at my beloved husband William's memorial service, while I stood there in my black dress with tears still fresh on my cheeks, I heard my own sister Sarah whisper to my brother David behind the funeral flowers, "Thank God that's over. Now we can finally sell the house and split the money." I felt my heart stop beating for a moment, but I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept my head bowed in fake grief while my mind began planning something they would never see coming. Thanks for being here with me today. Before we begin this journey together, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. My name is Isabella Jones, and I'm 62 years old. What I'm about to share with you happened just 2 weeks ago, but it feels like a lifetime. For 45 years, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought blood was thicker than water, that siblings would protect each other through anything. I was wrong about so many things, but I was right about one thing that saved me. Never underestimate a grieving woman's ability to hear everything. The morning of William's memorial service started like any other devastating day. I woke up in our king-sized bed, reaching instinctively for his warm body, only to remember again that he was gone. The house felt impossibly quiet without his morning coffee ritual, without his deep voice calling out, "Good morning, beautiful," from the kitchen. For 3 months, I'd been waking up to this crushing silence, but today felt different. Today, I had to say goodbye to him in front of everyone who claimed to love us both. I chose my black dress carefully. The one William always said made me look like royalty. It was a simple A-line with 3/4 sleeves, modest but elegant, paired with the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 40th anniversary. I wanted to honor his memory properly, to show the world that Isabella Jones knew how to carry herself with dignity even in the darkest hour. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked older than her 62 years, grief having carved new lines around my eyes and mouth, but my posture was still straight, my chin still lifted with the pride William had always admired. The First Baptist Church of Oakland was exactly as I'd requested. White lilies and pink roses, William's favorite colors, arranged in cascades around his mahogany casket. The church was fuller than I'd expected, with faces from every chapter of our life together. Colleagues from the postal service where William had worked for 30 years, neighbors from our tree-lined street, church members who'd watched us grow old together in the same pew every Sunday for 2 decades. Sarah arrived wearing a black pantsuit that looked like she'd grabbed it from the clearance rack that morning, her graying brown hair pulled back in a messy bun. She hugged me with what felt like genuine warmth, her eyes even producing a few tears as she whispered, "I'm so sorry, Bella. William was such a good man." For a moment, I almost believed she meant it. David showed up 20 minutes late, as usual, his black suit wrinkled and his tie crooked, mumbling apologies about traffic that fooled no one. He'd always been the irresponsible one, the brother who borrowed money and forgot to pay it back, who showed up to family dinners empty-handed but left with leftovers. During the service, I sat in the front pew between Camille Jackson, my best friend of 30 years, and Reverend Angela Monroe, who had officiated our wedding and knew our love story better than anyone. Camille held my hand throughout the entire service, her presence more comforting than any words could have been. She understood that some grief is too deep for conversation, that sometimes you just need someone to sit with you in the darkness. Reverend Monroe spoke beautifully about William's generous spirit, his dedication to family, his quiet strength that had been the foundation of our marriage. She talked about how he'd volunteer every Christmas to deliver food baskets to elderly church members, how he'd spend his weekends fixing things for neighbors who couldn't afford repairs, how he'd treated me like a queen from the day we met until his last breath. Every word was true, every memory sacred, and I found myself crying genuine tears for the man who'd been my anchor for nearly half a century. But it was during the closing prayer, when everyone's heads were bowed and the church was filled with the kind of reverent silence that makes even whispers sound like shouts, that I heard them. Sarah and David were standing directly behind my pew, close enough that I could smell Sarah's cheap perfume and David's cigarette-stained clothes. Their voices were low, barely audible, but I've always had excellent hearing, something William used to tease me about when I'd catch him sneaking extra cookies from the kitchen at night. "Thank God that's over," Sarah breathed, her voice carrying none of the grief she'd performed during the service. "Now we can finally sell the house and split the money." David's response was equally cold. "I already called that real estate agent you mentioned. She says the market's hot right now. We could probably get 400, maybe even 450 for it." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The house they were discussing so casually, like it was already theirs to sell, was the home William and I had bought 40 years ago with our first big savings. It was the house where we'd planned to grow old together, where every room held memories of our life, where William had just spent his final months looking out at the garden he'd planted with his own hands. I kept my head bowed, my hands folded in prayer position, but inside me something fundamental was shifting. The grief that had consumed me for 3 months was making room for something sharper, something that felt like cold steel running through my spine. I thought about William lying in that casket just 10 feet away from me, how he'd worked double shifts for years to help us pay off the mortgage early, how proud he'd been when we'd finally owned our home free and clear. "She's going to fight it," David continued, his voice taking on the whining tone I remembered from childhood. "You know how stubborn Bella can be." Sarah's laugh was soft but cruel. "David, she's 62 years old and she just lost her husband. She's barely been able to function for months. Trust me, she won't have the energy to fight anything. Besides, we're family. She'll want what's best for all of us." As Reverend Monroe concluded the prayer and the congregation began to stir, I lifted my head slowly, dabbing at my eyes with the handkerchief William had monogrammed for me years ago. I turned slightly, just enough to catch Sarah's eye, and gave her the most grateful smile I could manage. "Thank you both for being here," I said softly, my voice perfectly pitched to convey gratitude and vulnerability. "I don't know what I'd do without family during a time like this." Sarah's face immediately shifted to concerned sister mode, her hand reaching out to pat my shoulder. "Of course, Bella, we're going to take such good care of you. You don't need to worry about anything complicated right now. Just focus on healing." But as I nodded and thanked her again, I was already 10 steps ahead of whatever game they thought they were playing. They had no idea that the grieving widow they were planning to manipulate had spent 45 years learning strategy from a man who'd taught her that the strongest people are often the ones who look the most fragile. To understand why Sarah and David thought they could steal my life so easily, you need to know the story William and I built together. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real love. The kind that grows stronger through decades of choosing each other every single day. I met William Jones in 1978 at a church picnic in West Oakland. I was 20 years old, fresh out of community college with a certificate in office administration, and he was 23, working as a mail carrier with dreams of buying his own home someday. What struck me first wasn't his handsome face or his broad shoulders, though both were certainly noteworthy. It was the way he talked about the future, like it was something we could build with our own hands, not something that just happened to us. Our courtship was old-fashioned and intentional. William would pick me up for Sunday drives in his carefully maintained 1975 Buick, and we'd explore different neighborhoods around the Bay Area, looking at houses and dreaming out loud about the life we wanted to create. He never made promises he couldn't keep, but everything he promised, he delivered. When he said he'd call, he called. When he said he'd be somewhere, he was there early. When he said he loved me, I felt it in every action that followed. We married in 1980 in the same church where we held his memorial service 2 weeks ago. I wore my grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit my taller frame, and William wore a navy blue suit that he'd saved for months to buy. We honeymooned for 3 days in Monterey, staying in a modest motel but walking the beaches like we owned the entire coastline. On our last night there, William took my hand as we watched the sunset and made me a promise that shaped our entire marriage. "Isabella, I will work every day to make sure you never regret choosing me." For 45 years, he kept that promise. We started our marriage in a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Oakland, but William had bigger plans. Every morning before his postal route, he'd study real estate listings in the newspaper, learning property values and neighborhood trends. Every evening after dinner, we'd sit at our small kitchen table and plan our budget down to the last penny. We lived on my secretary's salary and saved every dollar of Williams Postal Service earnings for our house fund. It took us 5 years, but in 1985, we bought our first and only home, a 3-bedroom craftsman bungalow on a quiet street lined with oak trees. The house needed work, the kind that comes with peeling paint and creaky floors. But William saw potential where others saw problems. Over the next 20 years, he transformed that house room by room, learning plumbing and electrical work from library books, refinishing hardwood floors on weekends, building custom cabinets that looked like they belonged in architectural magazines. By 2005, our little fixer-upper had become the most beautiful house on the block, worth 3 times what we'd paid for it. But more. Importantly, we'd paid off the mortgage 7 years early through discipline and sacrifice that our siblings never understood or appreciated. Sarah and David, meanwhile, had taken very different paths. Sarah married young to a man who promised her easy money through get-rich-quick schemes that never quite worked out. She spent her 20s moving from one rental apartment to another, always one crisis away from needing a loan that she rarely paid back in full. David never married, preferring a series of relationships that lasted just long enough for him to borrow money for business opportunities that inevitably failed. Throughout the years, William and I had been the family safety net. When Sarah's husband abandoned her and their baby, Deshawn, we helped with daycare expenses. When David's latest venture collapsed, we covered his rent for 3 months. When either of them needed a co-signer, a loan, or just a place to stay during tough times, our door was always open. But I began to notice something troubling in recent years. The gratitude had slowly transformed into entitlement. When we'd invite them for Sunday dinner, Sarah would walk through our house making comments about our furniture, our decorations, our expensive tastes. David would joke about how lucky we were to have such a nice place, as if our success had been handed to us instead of earned through decades of careful planning and hard work. Last Christmas, Sarah actually asked William how much our house was worth, claiming she was just curious about the neighborhood market. When he deflected the question with a joke, she pressed harder, saying something about how it seemed unfair that some people had so much while others struggled to get by. The conversation made me uncomfortable, but William brushed it off later, saying that family sometimes says thoughtless things when they're worried about money. I should have paid more attention to the pattern that was emerging. Sarah's visits became more frequent after William's cancer diagnosis 8 months ago, but she rarely asked about his treatment or his pain levels. Instead, she'd make observations about how hard it must be for me to maintain such a big house, how exhausting it would be to manage everything alone. David started offering to help with our finances, suggesting we might want to simplify our lives by selling the house and moving somewhere smaller, more manageable. At the time, I thought they were being supportive, trying to help us prepare for an uncertain future. I had no idea they were actually preparing for a future without William. A future where they could step in and rescue his poor, helpless widow from the burden of too much property and too much responsibility. William saw it before I did. 3 weeks before he died, when he was still lucid but growing weaker each day, he called me over to his bedside with an urgency I hadn't heard in months. "Isabella, he said, his voice still strong despite his frails. "Body, I need you to promise me something important." I sat on the edge of our bed, taking his hand in mine, feeling how thin his fingers had become, but also how firmly he could still squeeze mine. "Anything, William, you know that. Don't let them take what we built together, Tom," he said, his dark eyes more serious than I'd ever seen them. "Sarah and David, they're not thinking about what's best for you. They're thinking about what they can get. Promise me you'll fight for our life, for our home, for everything we worked so hard to create." I promised him, of course, though at the time I thought he was being overly cautious, that grief and illness were making him suspicious of people who were just trying to help. I had no idea that in just a few weeks, I'd be standing at his memorial service listening to those same people plan the theft of our entire life together. As I sat in the church that day, feeling the weight of their betrayal settling over me like a heavy blanket, I thought about that promise. William had spent 45 years teaching me that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day to protect and honor what you've built together. Now it was time for me to choose to protect what we'd built, even if it meant fighting the people who shared my blood but had never shared my values. After the prayer ended and people began moving toward the church fellowship hall for the repast, I watched my siblings transform into the perfect picture of grieving family members. It was like watching actors slip into their roles, complete with costume changes in their facial expressions and body language. Sarah immediately positioned herself at my left elbow, her hand gently guiding me as if I might collapse at any moment. "Come on, Bella," she said in the soft, concerned voice she'd perfected over the past few months. "Let's get you some food. You need to keep your strength up." To anyone watching, she looked like the devoted sister caring for her fragile widow sibling, but I could feel the calculation in her touch, the way she was already taking control of my movements, my decisions. David flanked my right side, carrying himself with an authority I'd never seen from him before. He nodded solemnly at the church members who approached to offer condolences, thanking them on my behalf as if I'd lost the ability to speak for myself. "Isabella's holding up as well as can be expected," he'd say, his voice heavy with implication. "It's going to be a long road ahead for her." Mrs. Lillian Grant, my next-door neighbor of 15 years, approached with a covered dish and genuine tears in her eyes. "Oh, Isabella, honey," she said, pulling me into a warm hug that smelled like the lavender soap she'd always used. "William was such a wonderful man. If you need anything at all, anything, you just call me. I can help with grocery shopping, housework, whatever you need." Before I could respond, Sarah stepped forward with that practiced smile. "That's so kind of you, Mrs. Grant. Isabella's family is going to make sure she has everything she needs. We're already looking into some options that might make things easier for her." I felt my jaw clench, but I maintained my composed expression. Options. There was that word again, the same one David had used during their whispered conversation. I was beginning to understand that options was their code word for plans they'd made without consulting me. Camille Jackson appeared at my side like an angel, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic. She'd known me long enough to read the tension in my posture, the slight tightness around my eyes that signaled I was holding back more than grief. "Isabella," she said firmly, taking my arm, "I think you should sit down for a while. This has been an exhausting day." As Camille led me to a quiet corner table, I caught Sarah and David exchanging a look that lasted just a moment too long. It was the kind of look that passes between conspirators, a silent communication that confirmed they were working from the same playbook. Over the next hour, I observed their performance with growing clarity. They had divided responsibilities like a well-rehearsed team. Sarah handled the emotional manipulation, positioning herself as my primary caretaker and making subtle comments about how overwhelming everything must be for me. David managed the practical aspects, fielding questions about funeral arrangements and making vague references to helping me get my affairs in order. When Reverend Angela Monroe approached to check on me, David immediately stepped into the conversation. "Reverend, we're so grateful for everything you've done," he said, his voice taking on a tone of family spokesperson. "Isabella's going to need time to process all of this. We're thinking it might be best if she takes a step back from some of her responsibilities for a while." I watched Reverend Monroe's eyebrows rise slightly. She'd known me for 20 years. Had seen me organize church fundraisers, coordinate community events, and manage William's care throughout his illness with competence and grace. The suggestion that I needed to step back from responsibilities would have seemed absurd to anyone who actually knew me. "Isabella's always been one of our strongest members," Reverend Monroe said carefully, her eyes moving between David and me. "I'm sure she'll let us know if she needs any support from the church family." But David wasn't finished. Of course. It's just that grief can be so disorienting, especially for someone Isabella's age. We want to make sure she doesn't take on more than she can handle right now." There it was again. someone Isabella's age, as if 62 years old meant I was ready for a nursing home instead of potentially having 20 or 30 more productive years ahead of me. I was younger than some people running for president, younger than many CEOs, younger than plenty of women who were just hitting their stride in life. Sarah rejoined our conversation, carrying a plate of food she'd prepared for me without asking what I wanted. "I made sure to get you some of Mrs. Patterson's mac and cheese," she said, setting the plate in front of me like I was a child who needed to be fed. "You need to eat something, even if you don't feel like it." As I picked at the food, I listened to them field condolences from other church members, and their responses became more telling with each interaction. When people offered to help me directly, Sarah or David would intercept, explaining that family would handle everything. When someone mentioned how capable and strong I'd been during William's illness, they'd redirect the conversation to how exhausted and overwhelmed I must be now. The most revealing moment came when Deshaun, Sarah's 17-year-old son, approached hesitantly. He'd always been a good kid, caught between his mother's drama and his own desire to do right by people. "Aunt Isabella," he said quietly, "I'm really sorry about Uncle William. He was always nice to me." I reached out and squeezed his hand, genuinely touched by his sincerity. "Thank you, Deshaun. That means so much to me. Your Uncle William always said you were going to do great things." But Sarah quickly moved to his side, her hand landing on his shoulder with just a little too much pressure. "Deshaun, honey, why don't you go fix yourself a plate? Aunt Isabella needs to rest." I caught the look that passed between them, and something cold settled in my stomach. Deshaun's expression showed confusion, maybe even discomfort with his mother's behavior. He glanced back at me as Sarah guided him away, and I saw something in his young face that looked like an apology. As the afternoon wore on, I began to see the full scope of their strategy. They weren't just planning to steal my house, they were systematically undermining my reputation as a competent adult. Every interaction was designed to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to manage my own life. They were creating a narrative that would justify whatever options they had in mind for my future. When it was finally time to leave, Sarah insisted on driving me home, despite the fact that I'd driven myself to the church that morning. "You shouldn't be driving when you're this upset," she said, her concern sounding genuine to anyone within earshot. "David can follow us and drive your car home." As we pulled into my driveway, I looked at the house William and I had built together, and I felt something crystallize inside me. They thought they could manipulate a grieving widow into giving up everything she'd worked for. They thought grief had made me weak and vulnerable. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. That night, after Sarah and David had finally left my house with promises to check on me the next day, I sat alone in the living room that William and I had decorated together over 4 decades. The silence felt different now, not just empty from his absence, but heavy with the weight of betrayal. I'd sent Camille home despite her offer to stay, telling her I needed time alone to process the day. But processing wasn't what I had in mind. I poured myself a glass of the wine William and I used to share on quiet evenings, and I began what would become the most important investigation of my life. If Sarah and David thought they could steal everything I'd worked for, they had seriously underestimated the woman William had taught to always have a plan. I started with William's desk in our home office, the mahogany piece he'd inherited from his father and polished lovingly every month for 20 years. William had been meticulous about paperwork, keeping everything organized in labeled folders that made tax season a breeze. But as I went through his files that night, I began to notice things that hadn't been there when I'd helped him organize them just 6 months ago. In the folder marked Insurance and Benefits, I found documents I'd never seen before. Brochures for assisted living facilities, all with handwritten notes in Sarah's distinctive looping handwriting. "Good reviews," she'd written on one, "accepts Medicaid," on another, "close to my house," on a third. The dates on these brochures went back 4 months, which meant Sarah had been researching places to put me while William was still alive, while I was caring for him around the clock, while she was pretending to be the supportive sister bringing us casseroles and offering help with doctor's appointments. My hands started trembling as I found more evidence of their planning, real estate market analysis sheets that David had obviously printed from online sources, with our address highlighted and estimated property values circled in red ink. There were handwritten calculations in the margins showing what the house might sell for, minus realtor fees split three ways. They'd already decided that I would get only 1/3 of the value of the home I'd lived in for 40 years, the home I'd helped pay for, the home where I'd nursed my dying husband. In William's email account, which I'd helped him set up years ago, I found a trail of correspondence that made my blood run cold. David had been emailing real estate agents for months, asking about market conditions and the best strategies for selling a house quickly. In one email dated just 3 weeks ago, while William was in hospice care, David had written, "The property owner is elderly and will likely need to make decisions about downsizing soon due to changed family circumstances. What would be the fastest way to get this type of property ready for market?" But the most damning evidence was in Sarah's text messages to David, which I found when I checked William's old phone that we'd kept as a backup. Apparently, Sarah had been texting both William's number and David's number in the same group thread, not realizing that William's phone was still receiving messages. "She's getting more confused every day," Sarah had texted just last week. "Yesterday, she asked me the same question 3 times. We need to move faster on this." David's response, "I already talked to a lawyer about guardianship proceedings. If we can show she's not competent to make financial decisions, we can get court approval to sell the house for her own protection." My vision blurred with rage. I had never asked Sarah the same question 3 times. I had never shown any signs of confusion or memory problems. She was fabricating evidence of mental decline to justify stealing my home and my independence. The text thread continued with more strategic planning. Sarah had been documenting every time I seemed tired, every moment when grief made me quiet or reflective, every instance when I didn't immediately respond to a question because my mind was on William's suffering. She was building a case that I was mentally incompetent, using my natural grief reactions as evidence that I couldn't take care of myself. "The key is getting her to trust us completely," Sarah had written. "If we can get her to sign power of attorney documents before she realizes what's happening, we can handle everything without involving the courts." David's reply was even worse. "I've been softening her up by talking about how overwhelming everything must be. I think she's almost ready to let us take over the financial stuff. Once we have control of her accounts, selling the house will be easy." I had to set the phone down and take several deep breaths. These weren't random thoughts or casual conversations. This was a calculated campaign to steal my life, orchestrated by the people who were supposed to love and protect me. They had been planning this for months, watching William die while they plotted how to profit from my grief. I spent the next 2 hours going through every document, every email, every scrap of paper that might give me more insight into their plan. I found business cards for estate sale companies, brochures for senior living communities, and even a folder of legal documents about conservatorship proceedings. They had done their homework, researching every aspect of how to legally strip an elderly person of their rights and property. But they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated me completely. As I sat surrounded by evidence of their betrayal, I thought about what William would do in this situation. He had always taught me that knowledge was power, but only if you used it strategically. He would gather all the facts, make a plan, and then execute it with precision and patience. I began organizing everything I'd found into clear categories: evidence of premeditation, proof of their false narrative about my mental state, documentation of their financial motivations, and records of their deceptive behavior. Each piece of evidence went into a separate folder, labeled and dated, creating a timeline that told the story of their conspiracy. Then, I did something that would have surprised my siblings if they'd known about it. I pulled out my laptop and started researching my own legal options. I looked up elder abuse laws, property rights, and legal protections for widows. I researched lawyers who specialized in family financial crimes and elder exploitation. I even found information about how to properly document evidence and protect myself from false guardianship proceedings. By 3 in the morning, I had a clear picture of both their plan and my options for fighting back. They thought they were dealing with a confused, overwhelmed widow who would gratefully accept their help. Instead, they were about to face a woman who had spent 45 years learning from one of the most strategic men I'd ever known. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in William's chair, looking out at the garden he'd tended so lovingly. "You were right, my love," I whispered to his memory. "They weren't trying to help me, but they have no idea what they've started. Tomorrow, I would begin the most important fight of my life, and unlike Sarah and David, I would be fighting with truth, justice, and the law on my side." The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity I hadn't felt since before William's diagnosis. Grief was still there, still aching in my chest like a physical wound, but it was no longer the only thing driving my decisions. Now I had purpose, and purpose gave me strength. I called in sick to my part-time job at the community center, something I'd rarely done in 15 years of employment. But today, I had more important work to do. By 9 a.m., I was dressed in my best navy blue suit, the one I wore to important meetings, and I was ready to begin the fight for my life. My first stop was the law office of attorney Julian Price, a man Camille had recommended when her own mother had faced elder abuse issues 5 years earlier. His office was in a converted Victorian house in downtown Oakland, with warm wood paneling and family photos that immediately put me at ease. Julian Price was a tall, distinguished black man in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the sort of calm presence that suggested he'd seen every kind of family crisis imaginable. "Mrs. Jones," he said as his secretary showed me into his office, "I'm very sorry for your loss. Camille Jackson spoke highly of you when she called to recommend my services. She mentioned you might be dealing with some family complications during your bereavement." I placed the folder of evidence I'd organized the night before on his desk. "Mr. Price, my siblings are planning to steal my house and have me declared mentally incompetent so they can control my finances. I have documentation of their entire conspiracy, and I need to know how to protect myself legally." His eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't look surprised. In his line of work, family betrayal was probably a regular occurrence. He spent the next hour reviewing every document I'd brought, asking precise questions about dates, relationships, and my siblings' access to my personal information. "Mrs. Jones," he said finally, "what you've discovered is a textbook case of elder financial abuse conspiracy. The good news is that you've documented everything beautifully and you've come to me before they've actually succeeded in taking anything. The bad news is that they've done their homework, and if you don't act quickly, they could cause you significant legal and financial problems." He explained that my siblings could file for emergency guardianship if they could convince a judge I was mentally incapacitated. Even if such a filing ultimately failed, it could freeze my assets and force me into costly legal battles. "The key," he said, "is to get ahead of their strategy. We need to demonstrate proactively that you are completely competent, and we need to create legal barriers that will make it impossible for them to proceed with their plan." Julian outlined a comprehensive protection strategy. First, we would schedule a complete cognitive assessment with a geriatric psychiatrist who could provide legal documentation of my mental competency. Second, we would revise my estate planning documents to explicitly prevent my siblings from having any control over my affairs. Third, we would prepare evidence of their conspiracy to present to law enforcement if they attempted to file false guardianship papers. "I also recommend," Julian said, "that you consider installing security cameras in your home and possibly recording devices for any future conversations with your siblings. If they're building a false narrative about your mental state, we need to be able to prove they're lying." My second stop was the bank where William and I had done business for 30 years. I met with Mrs. Sandra Chen, the branch manager who had helped us with our mortgage and investment accounts over the years. I explained the situation and asked what protections the bank could offer. "Mrs. Jones," she said, her expression growing serious, "this is unfortunately more common than people realize. I'm going to place fraud alerts on all your accounts immediately, which means that any attempt to add new authorized users or make large withdrawals will require additional verification. We can also set up a system where you receive text alerts for any account activity over a certain amount." She helped me change all my online banking passwords and security questions, using information that only William and I would have known. We also established a new safe deposit box where I could store important documents, with access restricted to me alone. My third stop was the most emotionally difficult, a visit to Detective Elena Navarro at the Oakland Police Department. Julian had called ahead to explain the situation, and Detective Navarro specialized in elder abuse cases. She was a compact woman with short black hair and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. "Mrs. Jones," she said as we sat in her office, "I want you to know that what you're describing is a serious crime. Elder financial abuse is a felony in California, and conspiracy to commit fraud carries significant penalties. The evidence you've gathered is excellent, but we need to be strategic about how we proceed." Detective Navarro explained that while we had clear evidence of planning and intent, we needed to catch my siblings in the act of actually attempting the fraud before criminal charges could be filed. "However," she said, "I can open a case file now, which means that if they do try to move forward with false guardianship proceedings or forged documents, we'll be ready to act immediately." She also gave me advice about protecting myself physically. People who are desperate enough to steal family property are sometimes desperate enough to escalate to other forms of abuse. Make sure your neighbors know what's happening, change your locks, and don't ever let your siblings into your house alone. By afternoon, I felt like I was building an army of protection around myself, but I knew that legal preparation was only half the battle. I also needed to strengthen my personal support network and gather character witnesses who could testify to my competency if needed. I called Reverend Angela Monroe and asked if we could meet privately. When I explained the situation, her reaction was immediate and fierce. "Isabella Jones, those siblings of yours have lost their minds if they think they can take advantage of you during your time of grief. What do you need from me?" I asked her to write a letter documenting my involvement in church activities, my competency in managing William's care, and her professional opinion of my mental state. She agreed immediately and said she would also speak to other church members who could provide similar character references. My final stop of the day was the most important one, a visit to my neighbor, Mrs. Lillian Grant. She welcomed me into her kitchen with the same warmth she'd shown for 15 years, but her expression grew troubled as I explained what I'd discovered. "I knew something was off about those two," she said, shaking her gray head. "Last month, that sister of yours was in your backyard with a tape measure measuring the size of your garden beds. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she was helping you plan some spring planting. But it didn't make sense because you and William had already done all your spring planting before he got too sick." Mrs. Grant had been watching my house carefully during William's illness, keeping an eye out for my safety and well-being. Now I asked her to continue that vigilance and to document any suspicious activity from my siblings. "Isabella," she said, taking my hands in her weathered ones, "you've been like a daughter to me and Harold for all these years. If those people think they can steal from you, they're going to have to go through this entire neighborhood first." As I walked home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope mixed with determination. Sarah and David thought they were preying on a helpless widow, but they were actually about to face a woman backed by lawyers, law enforcement, church community, and neighbors who had watched me handle 45 years of life with grace and competence. That night, I took one final step in my preparation. I called Camille Jackson and invited her over for coffee the next morning. When she arrived, carrying her famous banana bread and wearing the concerned expression I'd grown to love over 30 years of friendship, I laid out everything I'd discovered and everything I'd planned. "Isabella, honey," she said after I'd finished explaining, "you know I'll support you in anything you need to do. But are you sure you're ready for this kind of fight? These people are your family." I poured us both another cup of coffee and looked out at the garden William had planted, where his roses were just beginning to bloom despite his absence. "Camille, family doesn't try to steal your home while you're grieving. Family doesn't build cases to have you declared mentally incompetent. Family doesn't count your money while you're saying goodbye to your husband." I turned back to her, feeling the steel in my spine that William had always admired. Real family protects each other. What Sarah and David are planning isn't family love, it's criminal conspiracy. Camille nodded slowly, her wise eyes reflecting years of watching people navigate difficult situations. "Then what do you need me to do?" I smiled for the first time in days. "I need you to be here tomorrow afternoon when I invite Sarah and David over for a family meeting. I need you to witness whatever they say, and I need you to make sure I don't lose my temper when they reveal exactly who they really are." She reached across my kitchen table and squeezed my hand. "William would be so proud of how you're handling this. He always said you were the strongest woman he'd ever known." Tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of my preparation. It was time to let my siblings show their true colors, and I would be ready to document every word. I called Sarah the next morning, putting on my most fragile, uncertain voice. "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about what you and David said at the memorial service about helping me figure out my options. Would you both be able to come over this afternoon? I think I'm ready to talk about what comes next." The eagerness in Sarah's voice was unmistakable. "Of course, Bella. I'm so glad you're ready to let us help you through this difficult time. David and I have been so worried about you managing everything alone. Could you come around 2 p.m.? And Sarah, I hope you don't mind, but I asked Camille to be here too. You know how she's always been like family to me, and I feel more comfortable discussing important things when she's around." There was a brief pause. "Well, of course. Camille's always been a good friend to you. We'll see you at 2. By 1:30 p.m., I had everything in place. The recording device that Julian had recommended was hidden in the centerpiece on my dining room table, positioned to capture conversation from anywhere in the room. I tested it 3 times to make sure it was working perfectly. Camille arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a pot of her famous sweet tea and wearing the kind of supportive expression that comes from 40 years of friendship. "You sure you're ready for this, Isabella?" she asked, as we arranged the refreshments on my good china, the wedding set that William and I had received from his grandmother. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I replied, smoothing down my navy dress and checking my appearance in the hall mirror. I wanted to look composed but not too strong, capable but not threatening. The performance of my life was about to begin. Sarah and David arrived precisely at 2 p.m., both carrying folders and wearing expressions of concerned family members, ready to take charge of a difficult situation. Sarah hugged me with what felt like genuine warmth, and David pecked my cheek while making sympathetic noises about how hard everything must be for me. "Camille, so good to see you," Sarah said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "We appreciate you being here to support Isabella during this transition." Transition. That word made my skin crawl, but I maintained my composed expression as we all settled around my dining room table. "Well," I began, my voice carefully modulated to sound uncertain, "I've been thinking about what you both said about options, about making things easier for me. I have to admit, everything does feel overwhelming since William passed. I don't know if I'm making good decisions anymore." David leaned forward, his folder already opening. "Isabella, that's completely normal. Grief affects everyone differently, and managing finances and property maintenance is stressful, even under the best circumstances. That's why Sarah and I want to help you explore some alternatives that might reduce the burden on you." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "We've done some research, and there are some really wonderful communities where you could live without all the stress of maintaining a big house. Places where meals are provided, where there are activities and social opportunities, where you wouldn't have to worry about repairs or yard work." I let my eyes widen slightly, as if the idea was new and overwhelming. "You mean like retirement communities? But those are so expensive. I couldn't possibly afford something like that." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. David and Sarah exchanged that look again, the silent communication between conspirators that I'd learned to recognize. "Well," David said carefully, "that's where we think we can help. Your house has appreciated significantly over the years. If you were to sell it, the proceeds would easily cover the cost of a nice senior living community, with plenty left over for your other needs." Camille sat perfectly still beside me, but I could feel the tension radiating from her as she listened to my siblings casually discuss selling my home as if it were already decided. Sell the house? I let my voice shake slightly. But this is where William and I built our life together. This is where all our memories are. Sarah reached across the table and patted my hand in a gesture that would have looked comforting to anyone who didn't know what I knew about her true intentions. "Bella, honey, I know it's hard to think about leaving all those memories behind, but keeping up with this house is going to become impossible for you. The yard work alone is too much for someone your age. And what if something major breaks down? The roof, the furnace, the plumbing. Those kinds of repairs can cost thousands of dollars." David opened his folder and pulled out several brochures, the same ones I'd found in William's desk. "We've identified some excellent facilities that would be perfect for you. This one is particularly nice, and it's only 20 minutes from Sarah's house, so family could visit regularly." I picked up one of the brochures, noting how David had conveniently chosen the facilities closest to their homes, rather than considering what might be most comfortable for me. "These do look nice," I said hesitantly. "But selling the house? That seems like such a big decision. I don't know if I'm ready to make that kind of choice right now." This was where their carefully rehearsed strategy kicked into high gear. Sarah and David began working in perfect coordination, like a sales team that had practiced their pitch extensively. "Isabella," Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a confused child, "the real estate market is excellent right now. If you wait too long, property values might decline, and you might not get as much for the house. David has already spoken to several real estate agents who are excited about listing the property." David nodded. "The agent I talked to thinks we could list it for $450,000, maybe even $475,000. After fees and taxes, that would leave you with more than enough money to afford the best senior living community in the area." I noticed how he kept saying, "We could list it," as if he already had authority to make decisions about my property. Camille noticed it too. I could see her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I suppose that does sound like a lot of money," I said slowly, "but I wouldn't even know how to begin a process like that. All the legal paperwork, the moving arrangements, choosing which of my things to keep. It seems so complicated." "That's exactly why you need family to help you," Sarah said, leaning forward with renewed energy. "David and I have been talking, and we think the best approach would be for you to give us power of attorney, so we can handle all the complex details. You wouldn't have to worry about any of the stressful parts. We'd take care of everything and just present you with the final decisions to approve." There it was, the trap they'd been building toward since William's diagnosis. Power of attorney would give them complete control over my finances, my property, and potentially my entire life. "Power of attorney?" I repeated, as if I didn't understand what the term meant. What exactly would that involve? David was ready with an explanation that sounded reasonable and caring to anyone who didn't know about their conspiracy. "It's a legal document that would allow Sarah and me to act on your behalf in financial and legal matters. We could handle the house sale, manage your bank accounts, pay your bills, coordinate your move to a senior community, all of that. It would take all the stress off your shoulders. And," Sarah added, "it would protect you from making any decisions while you're still grieving that you might regret later. Grief can affect judgment, and we want to make sure you're protected during this vulnerable time." I looked around the table at these two people who shared my blood, who had eaten at my table hundreds of times, who had borrowed money from William and me for decades, who were now sitting in my dining room explaining how they planned to steal my entire life for my own protection. "That does sound like it would be helpful," I said carefully. but I think I should probably talk to a lawyer before signing any legal documents. William always said important papers should be reviewed by professionals. The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate and telling. David's expression tightened, and Sarah's smile became strained. "Well, of course you could do that," David said, "but lawyers are expensive, and they tend to complicate things unnecessarily. The power of attorney forms are very standard. Sarah actually brought some with her today that we could fill out right now, just to get the process started." Sarah was already reaching into her folder, pulling out legal documents that were clearly pre-prepared. "I had a lawyer friend draft these for us. They're perfectly legal and standard, and it would save you the cost and stress of finding your own attorney." Camille finally spoke, her voice carefully neutral but with an undertone that I recognized as barely controlled anger. "Isabella, take your time with this decision. There's no rush. William's been gone less than a week. Maybe it would be wise to give yourself a few months to process your grief before making major life changes." David's response was immediate and revealing. "With respect, Camille, family members are in a better position to know what's best for Isabella right now. Waiting too long could actually make things more difficult. The housing market changes quickly, and Isabella's emotional state isn't likely to improve without the stability that comes from having her living situation settled." I looked at Camille, then back at my siblings, and made my decision. It was time to stop pretending. "You know," I said, my voice suddenly stronger and clearer than it had been all afternoon, "I think you're absolutely right, David. Family members are in the best position to know what's best for me. That's why I've spent the last few days learning exactly what kind of family members you both are." The change in the room was electric. Sarah and David both froze, suddenly realizing that something fundamental had shifted in our conversation. I reached under the table and pulled out my own folder, the one containing all the evidence I'd gathered of their conspiracy. I know about the text messages planning my incompetency hearing. I know about the real estate agent consultations you've been having behind my back. I know about the assisted living facilities you've been researching since before William died. I know about everything. Sarah's face went white. David's mouth opened and closed without sound. "I also know," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, "that I'm not the confused, helpless widow you think I am. I've spent the last 3 days consulting with lawyers, police, and financial advisors. I've documented your entire conspiracy, and I've taken legal steps to protect myself from exactly what you're trying to do right now." I placed the recording device on the table where they could see it. "This entire conversation has been recorded. Your admission that you've been planning to sell my house and control my finances without my informed consent is now evidence of attempted elder financial abuse, which is a felony in California." The silence that followed was the most satisfying moment I'd experienced since William's death. Sarah finally found her voice. "Bella, you're misunderstanding everything. We're just trying to help you." "No," I said firmly. "You're trying to steal from me, but you made one crucial mistake. You assumed that grief had made me weak. Instead, it's made me absolutely determined to protect what William and I built together." I stood up, and Camille stood with me. "I think this meeting is over, and I think you both need to leave my house immediately." As they gathered their folders with shaking hands, David made one last desperate attempt. "Isabella, you're making a terrible mistake. You can't handle all of this alone." I smiled, feeling William's strength flowing through me. I'm not alone. I have lawyers, police, neighbors, church family, and real friends who actually care about my well-being rather than my bank account. What I don't have is family members who plot to steal from me while I'm grieving. "You'll regret this," Sarah said, her mask finally slipping completely. "The only thing I regret," I replied, "is that it took me this long to see who you really are." As I watched them walk out of my house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete peace. The war was far from over, but I had won the first battle. And now my siblings knew they weren't fighting a helpless victim. They were fighting Isabella Jones, and I was just getting started. 3 months later, I was sitting in my favorite chair on the front porch William had built with his own hands, watching the roses he'd planted bloom in defiance of his absence. The morning sun felt warm on my face, and for the first time since losing my husband, I felt genuinely at peace. The war with my siblings was over, and justice had prevailed in ways that even William would have found satisfying. The legal consequences for Sarah and David had been swift and decisive. Within a week of our recorded confrontation, attorney Julian Price had filed restraining orders against both of them, prohibiting any contact with me or attempts to interfere with my property. Detective Elena Navarro had opened a formal investigation into their conspiracy, and the district attorney's office had filed charges of attempted elder financial abuse and conspiracy to commit fraud. Sarah had tried to claim that their plans were motivated by genuine concern for my well-being, but the evidence was overwhelming. The months of secret planning, the research into forced institutionalization, the fabricated stories about my mental decline, and most damaging of all, their own recorded words admitting to their scheme to steal my house. Her defense crumbled when the prosecutor presented the complete timeline of their conspiracy. David had attempted to plea bargain by claiming he was just following Sarah's lead, but his own emails and text messages proved he had been an active and enthusiastic participant in the planning. The real estate consultations, the guardianship research, the power of attorney documents they'd brought to my house, everything demonstrated months of premeditation. Both of them were ultimately sentenced to community service, hefty fines, and 5 years of probation with specific conditions that they were not allowed to contact me directly or indirectly. More importantly, the court had placed permanent legal barriers preventing them from ever filing guardianship or conservatorship proceedings against me. Judge Patricia Williams, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had clearly seen this kind of family betrayal before, made her opinion clear during sentencing. Elder financial abuse, Judge Williams had said, looking directly at Sarah and David, is one of the most despicable crimes in our society. It preys on people during their most vulnerable moments and violates the sacred trust that should exist between family members. The evidence in this case shows months of calculated planning to defraud a grieving widow of her home and independence. This court will not tolerate such behavior. The financial restitution they were ordered to pay covered all my legal fees and then some. Julian had structured the settlement so that the money went directly into a protected account earmarked for my future security, ensuring that even if they had wanted to, Sarah and David could never again claim I needed their financial assistance. But perhaps the most satisfying outcome had nothing to do with courts or legal proceedings. Within weeks of our confrontation, word had spread through our extended family and community about what Sarah and David had attempted to do. The response had been overwhelmingly supportive of me and condemnatory of their actions. My nephew Deshaun, Sarah's son, had been the first to reach out. He'd called me a week after the legal proceedings began, his young voice shaky with emotion. "Aunt Isabella, I need you to know that I had no idea what Mom was planning. When I found out, I told her she was wrong, but she said I was too young to understand family finances. I'm so sorry this happened to you." His call had moved me to tears, not just because of his obvious sincerity, but because it proved that the next generation could still recognize right from wrong, even when their parents had lost their moral compass. I'd invited him for Sunday dinner, and we'd begun rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty and respect. "Deshaun," I'd told him over my famous pot roast, "you are not responsible for your mother's choices. You're becoming a fine young man, and your Uncle William would be proud of the person you're growing into." Other family members had reached out as well, cousins and relatives who had heard about the situation and wanted to express their support. My cousin Marie from Sacramento had driven down just to give me a hug and tell me how proud she was of my strength. My nephew Tony from San Jose had offered to help with any household maintenance I might need, saying that someone should be looking out for me the way William would have wanted. The response from my community had been equally heartwarming. Reverend Angela Monroe had organized a support network through the church, with different members checking on me regularly and including me in social activities. Mrs. Lillian Grant had appointed herself my unofficial security monitor, keeping an eye on my house and making sure I felt safe and protected. Camille Jackson had become even more precious to me, if that was possible. She'd been my rock throughout the legal proceedings, attending court hearings with me and helping me process the emotional trauma of family betrayal. "Isabella," she'd said after the final sentencing, "I've watched you handle this whole situation with more grace and strength than anyone should have to possess. William would be so proud of how you protected what you built together." 6 weeks after the legal case concluded, I'd received an unexpected visitor that brought everything full circle. Detective Elena Navarro had stopped by to check on me and to share some news that felt like a gift from William himself. "Mrs. Jones," she'd said as we sat in my living room, "I wanted you to know that your case has become a model for how to properly document and prosecute elder financial abuse. We're using your evidence-gathering techniques and legal strategy as training examples for other officers. You've probably helped protect other seniors from similar schemes." That news had filled me with a pride that transcended my personal victory. William had always taught me that our actions should make the world a little better for other people. Even in fighting for my own survival, I'd managed to honor that principle. I'd also made some surprising discoveries about my own strength and capabilities. Handling the legal proceedings, managing my finances independently, and maintaining my home without William's daily support had proven to me that I was far more capable than even I had realized. At 62, I wasn't winding down my life. I was beginning a new chapter. I'd started volunteering with a local organization that provided legal advocacy for seniors facing elder abuse. My experience with Sarah and David had given me unique insights into how these schemes develop and how they can be stopped. Working with other seniors who had faced similar betrayals had been both heartbreaking and inspiring. Last month, I'd helped a 70-year-old woman named Dorothy, whose grandson had been forging her signature on checks for months. Using the strategies Julian had taught me, we'd gathered evidence and stopped the theft before Dorothy lost her savings. The gratitude in her eyes when we confronted her grandson reminded me why this work was so important. I'd also begun dating again, something I never thought I'd be ready for so soon after losing William. Dr. Michael Thompson, a retired psychology professor I'd met through my volunteer work, had asked me to dinner after we'd worked together on a particularly difficult case. At first, I'd been hesitant, feeling like spending time with another man was somehow disloyal to William's memory. But during one of my quiet conversations with William's photograph on my nightstand, I'd realized that he would want me to find companionship and joy in whatever years I had left. "You always told me to live fully," I'd whispered to his smiling image. "I think that means being open to all the possibilities life might still hold." Michael was nothing like William, and I didn't want him to be. He was intellectual where William had been practical, talkative where William had been quietly thoughtful, fascinated by travel where William had loved staying home. But he was kind, respectful, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences. Most importantly, he understood that my heart would always hold a special place for William, and he didn't expect or want to replace that love. As I sat on my porch this morning, I could see Mrs. Grant tending her flower garden next door, and I waved to her as she looked up and smiled. Deshaun was coming for Sunday dinner again, bringing his girlfriend to meet me for the first time. Michael was taking me to a concert next weekend, something William would never have enjoyed, but that I was excited to experience. My house was still my sanctuary, still filled with memories of the life William and I had built together, but it was no longer a museum of the past. It was a living space where new memories were being created, where friends gathered for coffee and conversation, where laughter echoed through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. I thought about Sarah and David sometimes, wondering if they'd learned anything from the consequences of their choices. I hoped they had, for their own sakes, and for the sake of anyone else they might be tempted to hurt. But I no longer carried anger toward them. They had revealed their true characters, and the legal system had handled the rest. My energy was better spent on building the life I wanted rather than dwelling on the damage they'd tried to cause. The most profound realization of these past few months was that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart. I would always miss William, would always wish he could see the roses blooming and share in the new friendships I was building. But his love hadn't ended with his death. It had become the foundation for my courage to keep living fully. As I picked up my coffee cup and headed inside to start preparing for Deshawn's visit, I paused in front of the family photo on my mantle, the one taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. William's arm was around my waist, both of us smiling with the confidence of people who knew they were loved completely. "Thank you, my love," I whispered to his memory. "Thank you for teaching me to be strong enough to protect what we built together. Thank you for showing me that real love creates courage, not dependence. And thank you for loving me enough to want me to keep living, even after you had to go." The morning sun streamed through my windows, illuminating a house that was still my home, a life that was still mine to live, and a future that held possibilities I was just beginning to explore. Isabella Jones was 62 years old, a widow, a survivor, and a woman ready for whatever came next. I truly appreciate you spending this time with me and listening to my story. If you enjoyed hearing about how I protected my family's legacy, please hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means everything to me and helps me continue sharing these important stories. Until the next story, take care and remember that you're stronger than you know.